Okay, you ready?
Yeah, we can get started.
So welcome to everybody that is coming to our webinar. This is the second MACAC webinar in the series. And today we're presenting Hannah Reed from Cranbrook Kingswood Upper School. And she'll be talking today and presenting about the LGBTQ community and how we can help those students. Thank you so much, Hannah, for coming.
Thanks, Sheila. So if you have questions throughout the presentation, just pop them in the Q&A. We will leave some time at the end, and we can go to the next slides. Perfect. Okay, so I'm Hannah, she, her. Again, like Sheila said, I work at Cranbrook Kingswood Upper School. This presentation is going to be kind of designed for both sides of the desk, so focusing on counselors, high school counselors supporting students, and also how we can support students in the admissions process. Next slide. Okay, so our agenda today, we're going to talk about why me, why this topic. I'm going to give you some definitions and background information. I know some of this might be repetitive for some of you. It might be stuff that you already know, but I don't know about you. I always feel like it's good to review stuff and just get a refresher, especially with these topics, because they're kind of constantly changing. Then we're going to focus on the high school counselor, focus on the admissions counselor, community overall, and then we'll have a little conclusion. So why me? Why am I presenting on this topic? I'm very passionate about identity, inclusion, diversity, equity, access work. In my role at Cranbrook, I am a college counselor. If you don't know Cranbrook, we're also a boarding school. So I also work in our residential program as a house advisor with our students who live on campus. They come from all over the world. And so I'm very interested in supporting students, you know, their whole selves in the dorm, in the college counseling process, within our academic program. And so I really am excited about this work. And additionally, I also had a really transformational professional development experience last summer. I participated in a gender spectrum inclusive schools network program. It was the best professional development I've ever done. So if you're looking for something related to gender, any program that Gender Spectrum does is fantastic. They also came and did a workshop with our whole upper school faculty at the start of the year, which was really effective. Just giving people, again, that background knowledge that they need to be really proficient in these conversations. So why do we need a special session for this topic? A lot of times people are like, why do we need a session for this specific group? We support all of our students. We're all counselors for all of our students. Why do we need a special session? I think for LGBTQ students specifically, the college process brings up questions like, who have I been in the past and who can I be in the future? For all of our students, the college process makes them consider who they are and who they want to be in the future. But for these students specifically, they're thinking about, you know, have I been out in high school? Do I want to be out in college? What name, pronouns do I want to use? And college often represents a chance to kind of reinvent themselves or redefine how they are perceived and how they identify and share themselves with the world. So it's a really exciting opportunity for them. It's often a crossroads where they say, you know, what's next for me and how can I take this opportunity to really think about intentionally what kind of community I want to be a part of. For a lot of them in high school, maybe they didn't have choice with that. Their parents, you know, whatever school they were in, but college might represent a little bit more choice for some students. And also, different students have different needs. So we just want to be aware of that and how we're approaching students to make sure we're all as supportive as we can be. I think as counselors, whether we're high school counselors, college admissions counselors, we all just want to make sure that we're accessing all of our students, including them, and making our communities feel like safe places for them. So LGBTQ, we're going to start with the acronym. There's other acronyms. Similar to other conversations about race, where you might see BIPOC, these acronyms are constantly evolving and changing. And it's just important to kind of know right now in this moment, what does this thing represent? And there might be other ones out there that people identify with more. LGBTQ, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, can also include questioning. You might see IA+, that includes intersex, asexual, and the plus just means there's more. It could include a lot of other things. Today, we're going to be focusing kind of on two different aspects here. One is sexual orientation and one is gender identity. So a lot of times when people think LGBTQ, they only think one or the other. Both of those dimensions of identity are really in that LGBTQ acronym. So we'll parse them out a little bit, but we're talking about both sexual orientation and gender identity, which are really two different things. So quick definitions. Again, if this is repetitive for you, just listen, enjoy. I hope that this is familiar to you. If it's not, maybe it's giving you some new vocabulary to use with students or colleagues. So sexual orientation and gender are separate. They're parts of our overall identity. Gender is personal, whereas sexual orientation is interpersonal. If that framing helps you think about gender being how we see ourselves and sexual orientation being who we are attracted to, right? Whether that's physical, emotional, romantic, that those are two different pieces of ourselves. Gender identity, we're going to go into more detail here. We're going to dive in a little bit, but this is about our deeply held sense of masculine, feminine, a blend of both, neither. It also includes name. It may correspond to the sex we were assigned at birth. It may not. We'll talk about that more. And the language a person uses might evolve and shift over time. So as someone evolves, we see this with teenagers and humans in general. People are constantly evolving, lifelong learning, identifying at different points over time. So that can be one of the challenges and joys of working with students who identify as LGBTQ is, one day to the next, these things may be changing because as humans, we're constantly evolving. So the next bunch of slides are directly from Gender Spectrum, that organization that I was talking about that I did that professional development workshop with. So these slides come straight from them. And part of the training that I did was they shared the slides and they said, please use these broadly. So this is sharing, not plagiarism. And I encourage you to, look into Gender Spectrum and see some of the resources they have. But the idea with gender is that there's 3 dimensions. So we're talking about not only our bodies, but our identity. So that would be the piece, how we identify ourselves, the social, so how we identify to other people. And all 3 of those are the dimensions of gender. Students, who are thriving, feeling wonderful and great, tend to experience congruence, which is when all 3 of those align and they feel like their body, their identity, and their social kind of all come together to feel really congruent. And that feels like a really affirming gender experience. And then all 3 of these also exist on a spectrum. So we'll talk about that a little bit more, the idea of the binary, non-binary, but all 3 of these dimensions really exist on a whole spectrum where maybe there's all kinds of elements going into how a student sees the body part of their gender identity, the identity piece, and then the social piece. And like I said before, the other essential idea here is that gender and sexual orientation are different. They're not the same thing. So let's dive into these 3 dimensions a little bit. First being the body. So this would be anatomy. A lot of people tend to latch onto the idea of like genitalia. There's a lot of other parts of physical sex that are assigned based on hormones, other things. So it's important to think about this as really like a spectrum, right? It's much more complicated than just one attribute. And this is also how we feel about our body, how we feel in our body. Identity, the next dimension, is a person's internal truth and the label they use to tell others. So this is how a person in their own mind, in their own psyche, brain experiences their own gender identity. So we have binary identities and non-binary identities. So a lot of people are very familiar with the binary identities, the idea that gender is either boy, man, or girl, woman. People who identify as cisgender, I identify as cisgender as an example. Gender identity aligns with their assigned sex at birth. Transgender, gender identity may be different from their assigned sex at birth. So we may have a person who is born and is labeled as a female and then identifies as male. So this would still be existing in that boy-girl kind of binary. Non-binary identities are much more broad. There's many different identities in this category. So you're going to have people who say, this binary of boy, girl, man, woman is really not something that I identify with. So within this category, you're going to have people who identify as demigender, gender fluid, gender queer. If you go to Gender Spectrum, they have really whole definitions of all of these things if you're curious about diving into more of these non-binary identities. So there's a lot of different things in this category. And so when people say, I'm non-binary, often what they're saying is, I don't identify with the notion that there's only 2 genders. I really believe that gender is a full spectrum and I'm somewhere on that spectrum, but I don't believe that it's one or the other. The final dimension of gender being the social. So this is the way we communicate ourselves to other people. And so gender expression. So this could include things like, names and pronouns that we communicate to other people. It could include the way we dress, the way we communicate, the way we express ourselves. So this is more about that interpersonal piece, how we're communicating with others about our gender identity. So hopefully that was kind of a good, quick snapshot of gender identity. Again, this is a really complex topic, and I hope that this webinar encourages you to kind of go do a little bit more of your own research. The important part about gender is that it's up to individuals to share their gender identity with other people. So it's not up to me to say, I think this person is X or Y. Students and colleagues and people in our communities, the same way we ask them to identify across all different other kinds of spectrums, gender is something that we should really honor and affirm when someone shares it with us and not question or judge or, right, that's implied because that's kind of how we all do our work. So a little bit of focus on the high school counselor piece, how to best support LGBTQ students. These are just a few suggestions. So there's all kinds of good stuff out there. These are some of the ones that I thought might be helpful ways to apply this learning in the short term, like you could start tomorrow. So including questions about preferred names and pronouns on questionnaires. We do a junior survey, for example. We ask all of our students to fill it out. We include things like, what is your name, pronouns, just because it gives students a chance to share who they are and let us affirm that for them. When you're talking to students about their gender identity, it's important to clarify and ask to whom they are out to ensure that you're being sensitive. So sometimes we have students who come in and say, I'm using they, them pronouns. I really don't want my parents to know. I'm not comfortable talking about it with them yet. And so we can affirm that identity in our conversation and in our space with them. A lot of people worry that, we're not sharing that information with parents. But when we're working with students one-on-one, even if they're not 18, it's not hard to affirm their identity. That's not something that we're not breaking any laws by saying, okay, I'm going to refer to you by the names and pronouns that you would like to be referred to with. And then in your own work, you can also use your own preferred name and pronouns when introducing yourself. Sometimes people are like, it's obvious I'm she, her, right? Okay, I'm obviously a woman. That's not necessarily the case. And also we want to normalize the use of names and pronouns so that it's not always our LGBTQ students who are having to introduce that concept to other people. If it's just something that's part of our community, then it creates space for all students to be whoever they are in those spaces. And so especially if you identify as cisgender, it's really good just to use, pronouns on a regular basis, just to kind of make that a normal thing for everyone. I wanted to just share for those of you that don't look at the Common App every day. I don't know how much time you spend on the Common App, but the Common App has evolved. A couple years ago, they added some more nuanced questions around gender. So they now have a section that offers students the opportunity to identify as non-binary, and it also allows them to add another gender. So if they didn't feel like female, male, and non-binary were inclusive of their identity, they could add another gender on. Legal sex is still on the Common App. That is for legal purposes. And so students still have to identify that way. Maybe we'll see that go away in the future, but that's still on there. And then finally, pronouns. So they have the option to add the preferred pronouns that they would like on their Common App. And so this would be another piece where if you're working with a student and maybe their parent is looking at their Common App, that might be a delicate conversation where if a student's not out to their parents, you would want to talk to them about how that might look. Another piece would be, in the recommendation letters that you're writing, making sure that you and the teachers are on the same page about how the student is being referred to in the recommendation letters. I think colleges are pretty good at handling complexity as they read applications. So if they see one name in one letter and one name in another, I think they can figure that out. But it's just something to kind of, the more proactive you can be. And, sometimes parents are completely on board and super supportive. So it's just a good conversation to have with a student about how this is going to be a factor in their process. Okay, now I want to share a few really great resources with you that you can use tomorrow with your students. My favorite one is the Campus Pride Index. This is the one that I always go to first when I'm working with a student who says, I really want an LGBTQ friendly campus. It's also important to keep in mind this part of a student's identity may be more or less salient to them depending on who they are. So A student might say, yeah, I'm gay and that's important, but it really doesn't need to factor into my college process. I don't care. I'll be fine in any community. And other students say, I really want a place that is super welcoming, super diverse. And so trying not to make assumptions about what a student is looking for just because of a part of their identity is also important. I've worked with transgender students who've said, yeah, I really need a campus that has super inclusive housing. And I've also worked with students who say, it's not a big deal. It's not a really important part of who I am. It's just kind of a side note. So when you're talking to students, making sure you understand, how important will this be in your process. So the Campus Pride Index is a wonderful resource. You can search by state, you can search by size. It's basically just a college search engine, like any other college search engine, with a specific lens on pride and LGBTQ students. They publish a list every year of, the best campuses, the most friendly campuses. I encourage you to share that with your students. It's a really great website. Next slide. Okay, so breaking down a little bit, this is from Campus Pride. Breaking down a little bit, what are some of these criteria that students are looking for? So when we say we want an LGBTQ friendly campus, what does that actually mean, right? How does that get communicated? So first would be active student organizations on campus. This is the same thing that students are probably looking for within your high school community. So if you're working with students, does your high school have a student organization that's active and accessible to students? They're going to be looking for that on college campuses as well. Out LGBTQ students on campus and faculty and staff on campus. The reason that's important is that there's visibility and support. People feel safe being out on that campus. That would be a signal to a student, okay, this is a place that is for me, versus a place where there's really no mention of it and people are closeted or don't feel safe being out. LGBTQ inclusive policies, we'll look at a couple examples in a minute of those, but just an awareness on the part of the institution in the mission and the way that it runs all of its programs. Is this a place where these students are being thought of and included specifically? And then also visible signs of pride. So, you go to a campus, it's really basic. Are there pride flags? Are there rainbows? Is it something that you're seeing? And that would be the same, again, on your high school campus. Do you see those same visual markers of support and inclusion on your campus? And if not, maybe why not? Okay, bunch more. Again, this is the top 10 list from Campus Pride. So outside of just LGBTQ people in the community being out, also allies being out, openly supporting this community from the bottom to the top. So not only, are your faculty supportive of LGBTQ students? Are they talking about it? But do you have administrators within your institution that are openly talking about this important community and how they're being supported and included? That would also include things like LGBTQ inclusive housing and restrooms when you go onto a campus, and that would be kind of a visible sign of pride and support, right? It would be like, here's an all gender restroom. Great, that signals this institution has thought about this and made an actionable step to make this more inclusive. Also an established center or office on campus. So when a prospective student goes to the campus, is it clear and communicated to them as just any prospective student, here's the resources available to these students. Also academic offerings around gender studies. This doesn't mean that every LGBTQ student is interested in studying gender studies, but is it part of not only the culture and the community, but also the curriculum? Is it something that is being academically encouraged and studied in addition to just the general conversation? And then finally, a social scene. This is important. Obviously, when you go somewhere, you don't just want to be on campus, you don't just want to be in class, you're interested in what kind of social scene is going to be available to you. So, on and off campus, are there places in the local community that are supportive of these students? So when you go to Campus Pride Index and you search Michigan, there are 2 institutions that come up. I'm not calling anybody out for not being on this list, but there are 2 institutions that come up as getting a 5 rating and being a phenomenal institution for LGBTQ students. The first is Oakland University and the second is University of Michigan. This is what the website will look like. And we can go to the next slide. So it will actually give you a breakdown of all these different things. So policy, inclusion, support and institutional commitment, academic life, student life, housing, res life, campus safety, counseling and health, and recruitment and retention efforts. So it will break these down, and you can click on those and see kind of how they do that rating if you want to explore this website on your own. But it's really nice because it breaks it down very specifically. In Oakland's case, I did a little bit of digging through their website. To the right there, you can see they have a whole link tree through their Gender and Sexuality Center. They have upcoming events. They have a peer mentoring program. They have a lending library. So there's just lots of supports in place, peer mentoring specifically for these students to kind of help ease that transition into their community. So policy examples, a couple here. The first is University of Michigan. Again, I'm only highlighting policies that are strong and positive. I'm not going to call out any policies that I think are not inclusive. You can do that research on your own. But for example, Michigan housing, they say right here, committed to providing a safe, inclusive, and supportive living experience for all students. So this says gender inclusive housing options allow students who identify as transgender, gender nonconforming, cisgender, and similar the ability to choose a roommate of any gender or gender expression. So not only are they saying, LGBTQ students, but this is for all students. Gender inclusive housing is for everyone. It is something that we believe institutionally, and it's something that we want accessible to everyone. It's voluntary, so for students that want to choose this, there's options, but it's also not, students can still choose to be in single gender housing if that's something that they prefer. So it's very inclusive of everyone. The next one, Oakland. So the mission is to provide a safe living and learning experience that promotes a sense of community, civic responsibility, and appreciation for individual differences. So they also have gender inclusive housing, and they have the opportunity, there's all kinds of different options here. So these would be good places to send your students if you're interested in, okay, is this campus going to be inclusive? Have them search on that college's website for phrases like gender inclusive or LGBTQ, and see what kinds of things pop up. One question that I've been thinking about over the course of the last couple of weeks is, what's happening with these single gender colleges and universities? So there are a lot of schools that were founded as single gender institutions. How are they handling the question of gender? For those of you that are not as familiar, Morehouse is a school that was founded for men. And so their policy says we are an institution for those who live and self-identify as men, regardless of the sex assigned to them at birth. Will not consider for admission women or those assigned male at birth who identify as women. So Morehouse is saying we are still an institution for men, but that is inclusive of transgender men. That still operates on the gender binary. So a student who is non-binary probably would not feel included at Morehouse, just as one example. But the institutions are kind of grappling with how do we evolve while we maintain integrity to our mission. You can see the same thing for Mount Holyoke and Barnard. Mount Holyoke says we welcome applications from female, transgender, and non-binary students. So that's a little bit broader and more inclusive. And they frame it as, we seek students who are deeply curious, the pursuit of big ideas, and a passion for taking bold actions make the world a better place. I really like the language there. Barnard says applicants who consistently live and identify as women, regardless of the gender assigned to them at birth. We will continue to use gendered language that reflects our identity as a women's college. So that one is a little bit more specifically still committed to the identity as an all women's college, whereas Mount Holyoke is a little bit more inclusive of non-binary students. So I would say if your students are curious about being in a single gender environment or an environment that was founded as an all women's or all men's college, this would just be something you would want to read into these policies and make sure that the student would feel included there. Okay, so moving on to the college admissions counselor side, how you can support LGBTQ students. Just a few ideas. I don't work on that side of the desk, so I'm hopeful that maybe people can put some ideas in the chat if they have other ideas. Hosting information sessions specifically tailored for LGBTQ students and partner with the experts on your campus. So if you have a gender sexuality studies center or professors who teach those classes, invite them in and have them be, because they're the experts on this topic, have them be partners with you in including, hosting information sessions specifically for these students. Also, prospective student panel with LGBTQ students. Maybe when you have prospective students come, offer them the option, sort of like Oakland has that peer mentoring, maybe offer students an opportunity to self-identify that way, and then pair them with someone who could kind of offer them that insight into the community for them. Also offering students the opportunity to meet without faculty and staff when they visit your campus. So thinking about all the different ways that when a student comes to your campus, how are you connecting them with the people that can share with them about that community and how they're going to feel a part of it. And then finally, in your own work, making your own communication with students inclusive, using pronouns in your email signature. You know, this is becoming more and more common. I see it all the time. And encouraging pronouns in your offices. Again, it's a small thing, and I think people focus on the pronouns a lot, but I think it is a really good way to communicate, hey, this is something we're aware of, it's something we're thinking about, it's important to us. So kind of just normalizing that on your campus, in your office, is a great way to communicate to students that you are inclusive. Couple things, these are really great resources. So this comes from the Trans Student Educational, I forget what the R stands for, I don't know if you can see it on there, but there's a really great website that has a bunch of infographics, even things like, you know, putting more stuff out publicly that communicates, you know, how your community can be more inclusive. Speak out, have a GSA, educate your teachers, LGBTQ panel, trans inclusive policy. So even just having some of this stuff out there, 5 things you should know about trans people, just education in your community is a really good way to just bring this topic up, bring it to other people. And then community, so how to make your community more inclusive. So we think about, you know, the individual and then the collective institutional. So offering professional development for your faculty and staff so that everyone is using the same vocabulary. That's the example I gave. You might not have people who work in your institution currently who are experts on this, but bringing someone in from a place like Gender Spectrum to do some professional development so that everyone is kind of on the same page. Reviewing policies to make sure that students feel safe and welcome on your campus. You can look at Campus Pride Index as a guide for that criteria. And then providing resources to students in a confidential manner. I think the next slide has, yeah. So for example, at Cranbrook, we have CranNet, which is kind of our student hub page where they can see their schedule, their homework assignments, all that stuff. And we have a college counseling page that includes things like resources for LGBTQ students. So we have a page. This is nice because a student could go find these resources without ever talking to anyone about it. So maybe they're starting to think about this, but they haven't talked to their parents or they haven't talked to their college counselor. They can still start to think about some of these things in a really confidential way, just via these resources that are available to them. So I would encourage you to think about how you're providing resources to your students. We also went to our, I think last year, 2 years ago, we went to visit our student group, our LGBTQ student group, and just did a short presentation about, hey, you know, if this is something that's going to be a part of your college process, here's some of the good resources you can use, just to make sure that these students know that we know that this might be a little bit different for them. So I just talked at you for half an hour. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to do some Q&A at the end. I just want to say, I think I only scratched the surface of some of this stuff. So I hope that this encourages you just to kind of go out on your own and seek out more. I would be happy to be in touch with you. If you have follow-up questions, this is being recorded and we're going to post it online. So feel free to, you know, share it with people later. MACAC is also on social media. That's just a plug for MACAC. So follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. And that's it. Sheila, do we have any questions?
Let me see. Thank you so much, Hannah. That was awesome. You did a great job. Let's see. I don't see any questions in there yet. We'll give it a few minutes, maybe, if that's okay. And then, yeah, you did a great job. It's a lot of information.
It is a lot of information.
Good. That's good. And this, like we said before, this will be recorded and put on the site, so you should be okay if you want to go back and look at any of the slides that Hannah has put together for you.
I'm going to put my email in the chat just in case people want to be in touch. Or
can you see the chat thing, the questions?
Yes,
question about Common App and the use of gender versus sex when having female and male as options. Is it still correct to label female, male as gender options?
Oh, good question. Yeah, so I would say gender versus sex when having female and male as options. I think the most inclusive way, thanks for that question, Sam. The most inclusive way is still just to give people like an open box, just to say, you know, what's your gender. I think we're not quite there yet. So I know it still gives the options of male, female. I think it's also like intersex definitely should be an option on there because that is a sex assigned at birth for a chunk of the population. I don't know why Common App doesn't have it on there. I think, again, I think we're on the journey, but it's not, the Common App is still not as inclusive as I think we would like it to be, but that's a good question.
So will the video be on the general MACAC website, and how can they access it later?
So yes, it will be, I believe, I don't know if the one from last week, we did a military service academies webinar last week. I know we have the video. I don't know if the link has been posted on the MACAC website, but I can make sure it gets up there. So good question. Sam, can you share more about your gender spectrum PD? So it was essentially just a really deep dive into gender identity and expression. And it really was not about sexual orientation. Gender spectrum really focuses on gender and gender identity. But it was a really, it was like a week-long program. It was all online. And they did a deep dive into all of these topics. It was really for educators more broadly. So there were people from, you know, lower school teachers all the way up through higher ed there. But it was thinking about, you know, all the different ways that gender permeates school communities and how we can think about all of these pieces like policies, community, teacher education, and how to just make, you know, they have a gender support plan that you can access that allows your institution to kind of personalize a plan that students can use when they want to, you know, affirm a gender identity at school that may be different from their sex. So it was just a really holistic, I wonder if I can find, let's see if I can find that and pop it in here. I think it was, yeah, it was through NAIS. So I don't know, let me share this, which is specific for independent schools. But I'm sure that gender spectrum does other PD that's not necessarily specific for independent schools that you could find.
Thank you, Hannah.
All right, awesome.
So do you see any difference between, do you know anything about how some of the boarding schools are handling?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I know that our Dean of Residential Life, our Dean of Residential Life went to the TABS conference, which is a boarding school conference, and went to a session specifically about boarding schools being gender inclusive. We're also working right now at Cranbrook on creating a gender inclusive visitation policy for our residential program. We still have very gendered dorms. It is something that we are getting a lot of feedback from students, current students, prospective students on about making our boarding program more gender inclusive. But there are, you know, it's kind of a spectrum. There are schools that have really inclusive policies. There are schools that are still very binary. So I think it's something that all of us are kind of wrestling with. I think in terms of gender, the areas where it tends to come up a lot is residential life and then also athletics. There's also the Campus Pride Index also has an index specifically for sports. So if a student is interested in sports, they can use that index to see whether a college's athletic program is inclusive for gender and sexual orientation. But I think those tend to be the big areas. Like within a classroom, teachers are generally feel more equipped to handle these kinds of conversations. But I think the boarding school, residential, and the athletics are still some of the big pieces where there's still a lot of work to be done.
That makes sense.
Yeah, that's a good question.
I don't see any more questions coming up.
Okay.
So do you have any, thank you so much for your expertise and all the information. Do you have any final words you want to say before we sign off?
No, I would just say, I think we all have areas of strength and students that we're really good at working with, and then some other blind spots and areas where we kind of need to do more professional development. I know for myself, I'm not super like well-versed on HBCUs, for example, or supporting Black students as they go through the college admissions process. So I think all of us, it's just good to think about like, where are my strengths and where are some weaknesses that maybe I need to just do a little bit more learning and professional development to make sure that I'm, the best counselor I can be.
Good point. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Oh, here's one more. The question, let me just see. Oh, just thank you for your time from Laura. See it. Okay.
Thank you, guys. Hope to see you at the conference next week.
All right. Thank you so much, Hannah. Good job.
Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.